Our season marking the events of September the 11th continues with a powerful film about the terror attacks on New York City. In memoriam, tonight on 4 at 9 o'clock. Can a couple find a house close to excellent schools and with a perfect kitchen? Location, location, location is property hunting in Bournemouth tonight at 8:30. Now though, with the time at 7 o'clock, Channel 4 News.
I'm going to call upon the world to recognize that he is stiffing the world.
Heat up on Saddam, Blair to fly to Camp David for talks.
To make sure that he fulfills his
Just when America seeks friends, Colin Powell is roundly barracked in Johannesburg, in trouble over the Earth Summit, or victim of a wider anti-American sentiment.
Much. I have now heard you. I ask that you hear me.
Good evening. Suddenly the pressure on Iraq is spiralling. George Bush confers with congressional leaders and for the first time promises to engage the international community over the dangers posed by Saddam Hussein. He'll talk to the UN, but will he pause for their endorsement? Tonight, the stakes intensify. Tony Blair flies on Saturday to talk with the president, Iraq the subject, and word is that he sees United Nations active involvement as key to the next step. Here, amid the chaos of the backlog of checks on teachers, the Education Secretary changes course. Unchecked teachers can teach. She's live here to explain. Still under 50, one of the world's finest conductors takes over one of the world's leading orchestras, Simon Rattle at the Berlin Philharmonic. He talks to us.
And the other headlines tonight, a glimmer of hope in the Middle East. Sharon says there's a possibility of peace talks with the Palestinians. Throwing the book at him, the FA charges Roy Keane with bringing the game into disrepute. And fame is paramount, how Vanity Fair snapped up 90 of the biggest names in cinema for a historic picture.
Today, the process starts. With those words, George Bush launched the diplomatic initiative intended to prepare the way for military action against Iraq. Speaking after meeting congressional leaders, the president revealed he'd invited his closest, so far only ally, Tony Blair, to Camp David for talks this weekend, before putting his case to the United Nations next week. But the international approval of the action is clearly not yet a precondition. Saddam Hussein is a serious threat, something this country must deal with, Mr. Bush declared. So what next? In a moment, we'll be hearing from our political editor, Eleanor Goodman in Westminster. But first, David Smith in Washington.
You know, this White House, the Bush White House, has a reputation, something of a reputation, for being heavy-handed, somewhat dismissive of the Congress at home and allies abroad. Today, John, a sea change forced upon them by the political reality. Not enough votes in the Congress for war with Iraq, and only the British, the faithful Mr. Blair, standing up to be counted alongside Mr. Bush. The result, John? Well, the president for the first time starting to lay out a roadmap of the path to war with Iraq, setting, it seems clear now, setting a quick deadline, an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein via the United Nations, promising, however, to consult. That's why Mr. Blair's coming to Camp David this weekend, and that's why the president himself will go to New York next week to address the United Nations, to spell it out to the world. With leaders of the Congress summoned to the White House today, the president suggested that while the United States can consider another attempt to get UN weapons inspectors into Iraq, well, personally, Mr. Bush doesn't believe it will work.
For 11 long years, Saddam Hussein has sidestepped, crawfished, wheedled out of any agreement he had made not to not to develop weapons of mass destruction, agreements he's made to treat the people within this country with respect. And so I'm going to call upon the world to recognize that he is stiffing the world.
Clearly, Mr. Bush will be setting deadlines on any UN process. The war plan not to be held hostage then by UN diplomacy.
The issue is not inspectors. The issue is disarmament. This is a man who said he would not arm up. This is a man who told the world that he would not harbor weapons of mass destruction. That's the primary issue.
The key may well be the evidence Mr. Bush can or cannot produce on Saddam's weapons. The suggestion in the past 24 hours, clearly coordinated between Washington and London, is that Iraq is close to nuclear capability. How that's presented to the world now, critical for the Bush-Blair axis. Axis, by the way, the word used at the White House today, after the Prime Minister's striking statement of support yesterday.
At the same time, I will work with our friends in the world. I've invited Prime Minister Blair to come to Camp David on Saturday, and he's coming. I look forward to talking with him about our mutual concerns about how to make the world more secure and safe. Saddam Hussein is a serious threat. He is a significant problem. And it's something that this country must deal with. And today the process starts about how to have an open dialogue with the elected officials and therefore the American people about our future and how best to deal with it.
Among congressional leaders, relief that Mr. Bush has finally heard the message that America must seek some form of dialogue before acting unilaterally.
Well, the president made a strong argument for the regime change, for the threat, and I believe that he has a convincing case. He'll be taking it to the Congress and the American people, and I believe that both the Congress and the American people will support it.
He's going to have Tony Blair come to visit this weekend, and that's the beginning of an effort to get a strategy that's shared by a lot of our allies in the world and to build the kind of coalition that we did in 1991.
Whether the Bush team actually wants another Gulf War coalition is debatable, and actually building such an alliance as things stand, implausible.
From David Smith in Washington to Eleanor Goodman at Westminster. Eleanor, the words are just beginning to sound a bit more like what Mr. Blair was saying yesterday, so they must be feeling he's slightly winning the argument on the UN. Flying to Camp David to persuade or simply to support?
Well, what Downing Street is saying is that this isn't a council of war, it's a thinking through session. That they're saying that we have the why it's necessary to take action. What we need now is the how and the what. What they'll obviously be discussing is partly the strategy, the question to the extent to use the UN, the extent to which they can internationalize the situation, but also the question of how you present it, because if you like, Tony Blair went out there in front yesterday and making the case for war. We know George Bush is going to do it over the next few weeks and days. And while it's rather presumptuous to talk, given the relative geopolitical strengths of the two countries, about Blair being the elder statesman, he is the one who in the past has gone out and sold in advance. If you think of Kosovo and if you think of Afghanistan, he was the one who was, if you like, making the rhetorical case. So I think he has a role in that.
Well, now, he's been between a rock and a hard place. The rock yesterday of clearly the pressure from his own backbenchers. The hard place, the persuasion of the United States to listen to the idea of UN involvement. How do they feel in Downing Street? It's going their way?
I think you have to put in between those, the rock and the hard place, his own view. And I think his own view very genuinely is that you have to take action against Iraq, that there is no alternative to some kind of action to make him give up those weapons. I think that has to be your starting point. Clearly, the preference of the British establishment of the Foreign Office, of Blair himself, is always to internationalise the situation, always to use the UN. They say, if you look at what's happened in the past, actually George Bush has done that, and therefore you have to some extent write off, or at least take it less account of the rather more bellicose noises coming out of Washington. And I think what is up for debate over the weekend, and you saw Blair himself allude to it yesterday, was the extent to which you can ensure that the UN is used as a way of actually progressing, getting action, rather than being used as a way of delaying it and giving Saddam some cover.
Eleanor Goodman in Westminster. So much now rests upon the dossier of evidence the Prime Minister has promised to publish in the next few weeks. But where will that evidence have come from? How can anyone know whether Saddam may have nuclear capability?